moving forward.
I think we'll go for a break. I think
Sounds good.
We only got a minute. We're going to come back and as a panel at 11:30, so will be another chance to ask the panelists or any speaker questions during the panel. So we'll see you back here at 11:30.
Thanks, Christy and Crystal.
Thanks so much.
Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're going to start our hopefully a more interactive session with the panelists. You've met three of our panelists already. We have Bill Hammond and Craig Allen and Crystal Kolden. And our fourth panelist is Joe Rostano. Joe is a senior environmental scientist at CALFIRE and works as part of the Fire and Resource Assessment Program. Specifically, he leads the California Prescribed Fire Monitoring Program. Prior to working at FRAP, Joe was a research scientist at the University of Washington, where he helped manage a nationwide network of research projects across a range of topics within fire ecology, including fuels characterization, fire behavior, carbon dynamics, treatment effectiveness, and biophysical properties of combustion and smoke. We're also proud to claim him as a Cal Forester. So Joe, thanks for coming. We intentionally invited Joe to give him more boots on the ground, and so I'm going to send him the first panelist question. Basically, how can available science be used to inform management decisions? Oops. You there, Joe?
You are muted.
Sorry, everybody. Thank you, John. And I just wanted to say thank you to all the previous speakers today. I think that they really did paint a good picture for how urgent things are right now. But I do want to appreciate that there are some places where we can really take the available science and try to move forward as we, in California, increase the pace and scale. And I think that, a lot of folks have already hit on this today as far as understanding where limitations are to prescribe fire, how effective thinning can be to structurally overcome some of these climate effects. And so I think that, more broadly, I think we just have to start acting and maybe talk a little bit less.
Do you have any specifics, Joe, or do any of the panelists have specific suggestions?
Happy to open it up to anybody else.
I mean, could we put, Bill, do you think we could put your forecasting, is that something that you could actually use a management tool going forward to think about where there might be more risk of mortality?
Yeah, when I think about management, to me, this is a very local thing, right? The local landscape and the local forest is probably going to have some specific drivers and interactions and maybe a particular biotic agent and fire frequency or suppression or both, and all of these things going on at the local level. And so this global view that I've given kind of at the plenary, what's nice about it is that in these globally distributed forest sites, some of these also included biotic agents. These are areas that burn sometimes, and there was a lot of messiness going on in these forests. It wasn't just one thing probably that led to mortality in all of these 1,300 plots around the world and across 48 years. And so what's nice about the climatic approach is that it can kind of at least provide an idea of the bounding conditions, the how hot is too hot, the how dry is too dry. And I think to an extent that's really useful, and that gets you part of the way there. And importantly, why it might be useful even in a more local context where you're trying to think about management of a particular forest, is that knowing those boundary conditions in your local forest can at least give you a way to predict how much risk you might run into soon. Whereas some of these process-based things, if you wanted to add into that model what's going on with the beetle dynamics and the fire intensity and severity and area and like all of these things, it just gets really complex really quick, and it becomes harder and harder and harder to get right. And so for this reason, to an extent, yes, I think it can help with management at local levels. No person's trying to manage the global forests as a single unit. And so the exact analysis I've relayed may not be directly prescriptive, but certainly the simple approach of trying to understand the boundary, how hot's too hot, how dry's too dry, I think that has a lot of utility. Especially you could kind of fine tune that on the time scale that maybe is most important to your local forest. And so that's one of the reasons we're making that data available, is we think that few people might want to look at the whole world at once, but someone might want to download all of California or their neck of the woods and say, what was the mortality like here, and what's my local fingerprint look like? Yeah.
Yeah.
To elaborate on that, Bill, I think this decentralized approach that we have in California with different forests and districts and CALFIRE units, almost is kind of an opportunity to get more diversity in our treatments. So, you've got this kind of unified command of, climate effects that's, obviously a tall order, but, this decentralization, I think really lends itself to some diversity and experimentation as we try to select management solutions across a wide area.
Great. I was wondering, one of the chats we had coming up while Crystal was talking, and it came up, where are the places where it's too challenging to do prescribed fire, or what limits prescribed fire, and getting it more out in the landscape? And Crystal gave a great answer back. I'm just wondering, if there's, what would your perspective be? Somebody who's literally monitoring prescribed fires across the state and seeing it firsthand, what the constraints are to trying to do that, which a big effort is that you're in some ways trying to lead.
Yeah, I think that there was a comment from Christy in the chat bar before this panel began about some of the lack of nimbleness in prescribed fire planning. It takes so long to execute all the environmental review and to get projects lined out, so that when you're trying to take advantage of novel opportunities like wildfire footprints or burning into black, those are areas where you might expect to be able to be more assertive. But I think Christy's chat comment really resonated with me that that's not exactly as easy as it sounds. But I think it all comes back to we have a variety of different burners in the state, and there's only a very few that have the opportunity to burn at scale because of their land ownerships. And I really want to empower people to be thinking about catchment scale, watershed scale, burning anything other than a large high severity patch. So explore the wintertime, explore night times, explore anything possible is my recommendation to start.
Are there knowledge gaps out there? Crystal or other panelists that think that would help to scale it, or is it more just an implementation problem?
I think that there's a lot of, look, when we're talking about fire under rapidly changing climate, we have a lot of knowledge gaps, right? And these systems are so stochastic that it's really difficult to say we know everything, particularly in the scaling questions and how much bigger we can make these. But, I think one of the key areas that I have seen my own science impact management, and I would say probably an indirect way, is that we have enormous power to influence policy. So Joe mentioned that, and based on Christy's comment, that there's this whole review process that takes so long to get through that there is really no ability to sort of reevaluate every season and reprioritize and replan, because everything with NEPA takes so long to go through. But those sorts of policies can change. We saw the fire bills that got pushed through a couple summers ago by Hannah Beth Jackson in the state. Now CALFIRE has a whole burn boss certification program, which is meant to try and increase private lands burning, right? I don't know about other folks on this call, but I have, as John noted, I'm pretty vocal on social media and have gotten a lot of my effort in the last year has gone into communication. And the result of that has been that I have aides to state Congress people calling me and saying, okay, we're hearing you. What would you have us do, right? And so where I think science can be really effective is influencing the types of policies, like reducing the interval for a review or fundamentally changing these. And we know that they can be changed, right? Because certain politicians have tried to expedite some of those review processes in ways that are often scientifically questionable. But if we can figure out ways to expedite some of these processes based on sound science, right, then we're doing something that actually helps facilitate better management at the local level that's more reactive and able to be flexible.
Craig, I want to throw it over to you for a second. So tree mortality is another, and we're worried about trees dying as far as one way, but clearly you've been watching trees die for 40 years and studying how trees die for 40 years and stuff. Where do you think, what would you want to do if you were the manager, of your, of the Southern Rockies where you work, what would you do? What would again, we're not supposed to do this as scientists, but I think you've earned that right to suggest, what might work.
Yeah, well, I've been co-located with land managers this whole time,
Right.
John, really. So I have those conversations whether I'm supposed to or not. I know USGS says, always you could do something, not you should. We can't do shoulds, but I just retired from them, so I can talk about shoulds now, I guess.
I'm giving you the chance. That's why.
Yeah, to me, as Crystal was saying, I don't view the tree mortality per se as catastrophe. Certainly, I think it's just these forest ecosystems are responding as they must. They're always dynamic. They've always changed through time. I think it's pretty understandable why they're resetting in ways more incremental or more abruptly. There's reasons why that's occurring in different parts of the landscape. Some of it's luck, whether you get like an ignition on the wrong or right day, depending on how you look at it. But it's always been that, the last 30, 40 years, even as wildfire in the West has ramped up again and the size of high severity patches have increased, it's still usually these fires have always been a third, maybe of it has been stand replacing fire. And so as Crystal was saying, the other 2/3 of the fire has been doing good work out there on the landscape that we can't get to otherwise. But I do the big old tree question, old growth forests, the values with those. I do. There was a paper I was part of a few years ago that Gordon Grant, a research hydrologist with Forest Service research up in the Northwest, led with Naomi Tague, about watering the forest for the trees. And, we manage a forest. Forest Service has tended, the forest reserves and then forest service lands were set up to a significant degree to safeguard forested upland watersheds for the use of society in the West, down in the valleys where most of the economic activity takes place. And so we've tended, in fact, a lot of research was done on trying to maximize like cutting patterns to optimize or maximize water yield downstream. But if we want the upland forests and all the environmental services, the ecosystem services they provide to hang on a little longer, we might figure out ways to manage these forests to retain a little bit more of the water on site in these upland watersheds. And I mean, obviously at an extreme level, you can, if you want to keep the General Sherman tree alive, I don't know what Christy thinks. I talk to Nate Stevenson periodically, when are you guys going to the drip system for the ones close there in the giant forest? At some point, I doubt the Park Service is going to just let those go down. When Adrian figures out that, Adrian Das figures out the vulnerability there model for them, and it looks like it's coming in the next decade. But, there's a whole extreme end of like, you could try to divert water and irrigate to things like all of this fuels management, fuels, the three-dimensional structure, the litter, it's providing how the water's cycling. There's a lot of really good work coming out of things like CZOs about how different three-dimensional patterning of the forest structures affects where the water moves through these systems. And those are some of the uncertainties that people are working on now. But when we get that sorted out a little better, we can maybe figure out how to manage fuels to try to not just deal with forest, fire hazard, but other things like we want to keep some of that water on there. We'd like another 5% or 10%, the farmers in the cities and people, there's trade-offs if we do that. But on the other hand, maybe we'd like our forests to last a few decades longer and give them more of a chance for us to see if we can bend the curve on, the warming. Maybe we can hold on to some of these legacy forests and that, it's just, but if we don't do something, the trend is pretty clear that, ultimately we're going to lose the historical forests, those forests, anything that's old growth established in a climate that isn't even the climate we have today. Anything pre-1880, these are forests that came to dominance. The old trees that dominate them are tuned to an environment, to a climate space that isn't even today's climate space. So, but again, we cannot yet realistically project how much more, right? Do we have a 0.5 degree C that we can grant them or not? Well, I would still, given the values for them, try to hold on to some of those values, but it's not even a consideration really, I don't think at this point.
Great, thanks. I think we have some questions coming in from the audience. Susie, do you want to?
Yeah, and they really relate to what Craig was just talking about. So the question was, with the chances of recurring droughts happening just to the scale that we've recently been having, what are your thoughts regarding adapting to wholesale change versus managing for resilience? And kind of related to that, another question that asked about whether or not we should be thinking differently about impacts from managing forests from timber harvest and such when we're looking at this long scale and changes to come.
Do you want to direct that at somebody or is it an open
Craig,
panel
I
question?
want to start with Craig
Okay.
because he was talking about
Well,
this.
yeah, well, the first one, I'll touch that first one in terms of like trying to manage for adaptive transitions. I mean, a lot of forest ecologists in the West have thought for some time that when we do have discussions with land managers is that we would support actions where to allow these forest ecosystems to respond more incrementally rather than overnight. That's why, you know, high severity stand replacing fire when it turns into these big patches looks like catastrophe because it literally is overnight transforming the system. And it is a filter. I mean, there's always winners and losers. Some things are winners. There's opportunities there for sure, Crystal, but not for all the organisms or not all the processes, right? And so, so the scale of some of those kinds of patches trying to manage for, you know, every fire is mixed severity, but not having the scale of, I mean, the creek fire, I saw another map just last night, actually, that CALFIRE emailed around to some of us. The size of the high severity map, the patches in that thing were pretty astounding. You know, it was a veg, you know, it was the veg impact, but it's like, ooh, the answer is that a catastrophe depends on where you are in that fire, I would say in part, right? If you're in the bottom of a watershed that burned from top to bottom, it could be pretty catastrophic in terms of all kinds of like watershed responses for at least a few years. Anyway, managing for incremental transition is, you know, opportunities for these systems to respond more incrementally, I think is just kind of a general principle that a lot of us support.
Great.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'd like to also toss that to Joe from like a state perspective as far as impacts from different types of current treatment strategies and the regulatory framework. If we're really concerned about moving forward and reducing the chance for these stark impacts, do we need to figure out how to allow more incremental impacts through our regulatory system? Or I guess that's sort of a general question, but does the CALFIRE
I'll be able to answer
perspective on that
adequately, but I do think that it's a combination of needing a proactive and reactive kind of approach where, you know, this you know, mortality event is not stopping, I don't think. There's some experts here that could probably speak more directly on that. So I think you've got to really prioritize, you know, all the different benefits that we're talking about, whether it's carbon or trees or water or whatever. You know, think about the north. Think about the areas that haven't been hit as hard. Think about what kind of structure you want for 20 years from now, when or less, when you're trying to deal with that. And then also you can, you know, react. And this is what I said before, which is trying to use these mortality events and these fires. You know, like use the creek fire, for example, to understand how these fires really burn through these novel fuel beds with all of this down woody, and really try to you know, think about how you manage for these novel conditions based now that we have a replicate, you know, or at least one, you know, see how we can go forward from there. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but I really feel like you got to have a multi-pronged approach here.
Well, one of the questions we shared with you, the panelists, was about the resource allocation, right? We can't do everything. And so, and Joe, brings up that dichotomy, and we've heard these other challenges. So where would the resources go? If what should we prioritize, and we prioritize by where we put the resources, right? I mean, anybody want to pick that one up? Or
Well, I can take a stab at that, John. And the much longer version of my talk that I've been giving to university seminars is the vast majority of our resources right now, whether it's the Forest Service or CALFIRE or anybody else regarding fire, is that we're focused on protecting houses and people and infrastructure, right? I mean, the Forest Service for years has watched its budget bleed away every summer to away from sort of forest management and trying to focus on forest health, and it's just all gone straight to fire suppression. And the much longer version of the talk I gave is about identifying how we can first and foremost mitigate fire effects to homes and infrastructures, right? Because if we can go back, remember 20, 30 years ago, we weren't really seeing these massive fatality events. We were not seeing massive home loss events. They were pretty rare, and they were usually in chaparral shrublands. And so if we can go back to a period of time when we don't have every fire killing people, when we don't have homes and structure losses on every fire, then we've actually got a huge chunk of budget back, right, for CALFIRE, for Forest Service, to actually manage these forest systems in a way that is focused on forest health instead of just trying to stop the destruction to human values, right? And that's the problem, is that we're always going to prioritize homes and structures, and I think that for me is one of the key reasons that I talk about understanding the differences between opportunities and sort of the really destructive outcomes on these fires, because we don't learn a lot when we just focus on wholesale suppression and saying that every large fire is catastrophic, right? If we can focus on just trying to do the things that that folks like Susie and Extension spend a huge amount of time on, and CALFIRE spends a huge amount of time on, okay, home hardening, defensible space, all these things. If we can get to the point where we're actually living with fire on the human side, then we can focus more of our time and money on the forest health side. And what's amazing is that when people aren't scared and running for their lives, they are optimistic about what we can do in these forests. I've been spending a lot of time wandering up into the creek fire, looking for some new study sites. And there's a neon tower. Many of you may be familiar with the National Ecological Observatory Network. So there's a neon tower at about 4,000 feet south of Shaver Lake. And after the drought event, they went up and cut down all the dead ponderosa pines. I have no idea who from the Sierra National Forest did this. They very optimistically planted giant sequoia seedlings there, where there's never been any giant sequoia. If anybody on the event knows who this was, I'd love to talk to them. But there's all these giant sequoia saplings now growing on this site so optimistically, and it's it was an area that, because it had been recently managed, was essentially right outside the creek fire perimeter, but it's so symbolic of hope for these forests. Planting these things that in my lifetime, it may grow to 10 or 20 feet, but it's never going to become those beautiful monarchs that we all love, right? But that time and energy and the financial support to do that really requires that we make sure that human values stop being at risk so that we can refocus our efforts in different ways.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question for Joe and Crystal, that relative to opportunities for more prescribed fire and allocation of resources. Yeah, I mean, so much has gone into suppression and so much of that to protect, right, human values in the WUI kind of stuff. But in Region 3 Forest Service, Arizona and New Mexico, there's been really a sea change that's been impressive to see in the last half dozen or maybe more years, but of wildland fire use, basically taking advantage of you know, like the NEPA is always so much in the way to do prescribed fire. The air quality issues are so overwhelming. But once a wildfire is out there, being able to and tie those into, this is sort of where strategic thinking, right? Where people have been strategically placing fuels treatments, both mechanical and with fire. And so they're starting to develop enough of a, you were talking about heterogeneity in these landscapes, Crystal, right? I mean, there's enough of it starting to emerge now, whether they're old wildfires or actual treatments, that they are looking first, the fire people here on these forests here in northern New Mexico are really looking for those opportunities for wildland fire use. And have had some really good successes with that. And I'm wondering whether that's harder in California. I don't know. CALFIRE, their responsibility, kind of the culture there has been really not so supportive, I think, historically, of prescribed fire. I don't know. But I'd be curious about what those opportunities are and whether that's happening in California too.
Can I?
Go ahead, Teresa.
Go ahead. Yeah, to cut in, that's a great question, Craig. And there are some impediments in California that you may have already overcome, which are that with the changed fire behavior and with the unknown fuel loading and fire behavior models that can't even accommodate those fuel loads, fire managers are very anxious about making those decisions to let a wildfire burn, because we're worried that it's going to burn into the WUI. And when you look at the perimeter of the Creek Fire, you look at the perimeter of the SQF, those all started in very remote areas, and they were full suppression from the get-go, and they still burned into the WUI and burned down people's houses. So it is an opportunity, and I can't speak for CALFIRE, but on the forests, between the parks and the forests are looking at potential operational delineations, fire sheds, basically, of where can you, when you have fire, let it burn. But in order to utilize that, we need better fuel breaks before it burns into the WUI, and we need better building codes and defensible space in the WUI, because we've seen a lot of bad outcomes for wildland fire spreading into those areas. And then the other limitation for us, and is also true for the Forest Service, is that if you get those starts late in the season where there's already a lot of fire burning in the West, you cannot exercise that opportunity because it's too much of a risk. There are no resources to come and help put it out if it escapes. So I would say philosophically, we're 100% on board. We're trying to get a better handle on the landscape to utilize those opportunities. I would love to see more wildfire do the work for us, but there are some serious limitations because of staffing and then data gaps.
And I would say that, you know, what I see in California, and this was a fascinating summer to watch these large fires develop because briefings were held on Facebook. Right? You didn't have to be in fire camp to hear the briefing. So, you know, I started listening to the Creek Fire briefings on Facebook every day, and then got into it and started watching other briefings. And what I think we have seen here that's different from the Southwest is that there are relatively few fires that are being designated as sort of, you know, it used to be wildland fire use. Now it's sort of the anything other than full containment strategy, right? That's how it gets designated. And there are fewer of those actual types of designations, but more of the, I would say, less aggressive suppression approach happening once these fires move into more remote areas. And public perception is a huge factor in this, because what we saw this summer was that, first of all, you know, there were quite a few wildland fire use fires or managed wildfires happening in the Sierra Nevada, despite it being a record extreme climate year, right? And this is a concern, as Christy noted. But Yosemite National Park had what, 6,000 or 8,000 acres this summer. They had 3 or 4 wildland fire use fires burning all summer long, and it was under the radar. And yet, really positive outcomes, great fire behavior. And then on top of that, with these other fires, what I saw was that you know, most of those large fires, they were joint command between Forest Service and CALFIRE, and the focus in the briefings was on over and over and over again saying to the public, we are protecting your homes, we are protecting your infrastructure. And people would ask, like, oh, why aren't you getting this thing contained, right? Oh, the Creek Fire is only 60% contained, right? And they would never say, you know, we're letting that burn because it's getting up into the wilderness, it's just dinking around and all that Sierra Nevada granite, and you know, it's not having negative effects up there, it's not safe for firefighters. They would just sort of gloss over that and really focus on what the public wanted to hear, which is, we are protecting these towns, we are protecting these homes, we are protecting this infrastructure, right? So what I looked at with that was, okay, we've probably got, you know, at least 100,000 acres on the Creek Fire, 25% or more, that was not designated as, you know, wildland fire use in the sense that they talk about in the Southwest, but was instead that management approach within a full suppression fire, right? And that is very much a function of public perception, because the
That
public,
happens here too.
yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
they're not always saying it, but when you're, I mean, that's what they're doing, is what you're saying, right? A lot of times is
Yeah.
they're just working it that way within the context of where they choose and what they're, you know, to
Yeah.
make the boundaries and the strategies they choose to implement within those, within the box.
But it's one of the reasons that I feel like, you know, surprisingly, I'm actually an introvert. I don't actually enjoy doing media, but I feel like it's so important to impart to the public that large portions of even these huge, you know, mega fires are actually doing positive ecological work. And it's a lot safer, a lot more cost effective, you know, and a lot better ecological effects if we use that strategy in some of these high country and wilderness areas. So.
I
Sorry,
might
that was
answer a question here from online. There's plenty of vigorous, interesting questions in the chat box that we're probably not going to get to, but one of them had to do with communication. And that's, since you were talking about that, Crystal, it wasn't necessarily just communicating the benefit of wildfires, but also communicating the climate fingerprints of what we're seeing. Is there some way that we can really communicate these climate fingerprints on tree mortality? And how important is that? Any strategies for helping the public understand what we're going through? I guess.
you me to take that, Susie, or
Why don't you let Bill take a first shot? And then
Yeah.
there we go.
So I think communicating that there are limits in terms of the climate that a forest will persist under is really important, because when we think about managing a forest and you're managing it while it's burning, there's a pretty urgent sense about what needs to be addressed, right? Like something is actually literally on fire. But when you think about managing for the next historical forest, right? That forest that 100 or 200 years from now will be able to persist on the landscape. If there are limits to what the current occupants, as Craig put it, there will be winners and losers, but not every one of the trees or the landscape positions or whatever have you about variability in a forest, not every one of those factors can produce a winner, right? And so understanding what these boundaries are is going to be really important. And I think that we're gonna have at some point some difficult conversations with concepts that are controversial, things like, do we decide to help these trees which can only migrate so many kilometers a year? Do we help them along? Do we put something in that maybe is going to, we think 100 years from now, even with the warming that's baked into the Earth system, going to have a better shot at persisting or a better shot at being a winner, and yet still fulfill some of the ecosystem and societal and hydrological benefits that we depend on our forests for? And so I think to an extent that's an uphill battle with regards to communication, but we have to be honest about what we do know and what we don't. The reality is, if you were paying at all attention to the talk I gave, we know almost nothing about even the basic climate boundary conditions of how hot's too hot and how dry's too dry. And when like there's probably way better ways to do it than I showed you today, but we need to be figuring those out, and we need to figure out how they're different on different landscapes. And then we need to apply that knowledge to what we think the forest might look like 100 years from now. I think a long view is just as important as handling the fire in front of you, right? I've spent a life in management of other things than forests before I became an academic. And I used to always tell people, you can put out the fire in front of you, but you might not see what's going to happen next. And I think keeping a long view in mind with all of these management actions is really important. And part of that long view is starting to understand what the boundaries on survival are for the current occupants of the forests. And if those are realistic occupants of the next historical forest on that same landscape.
Do you see that communication challenge, Joe, when you're out there? I mean, you're out there working with different entities, different organizations, putting treatments on the landscape. You must have all these in the woods discussions, or is this really focused on the near term? Do they have that slightly longer term perspective, or?
Much of the interaction with the public is on the near term. They're more concerned about smoke than they are about climate change in general. And so the idea of, trying to it's already hard enough to convey that prescribed fire and other treatments are needed and in fact safer than the alternative, which is, maybe undesirable. So yeah, most of it kind of steers towards just the low-hanging fruit, quite honestly. I think that science education more broadly, to get on a soapbox, is something we should all be investing in. Early childhood science education, getting people not only understanding climate change, but also ecology and physics and all these other things that go into these types of decisions.
Greg, I was wondering what your perspective was. I mean, you mentioned it before, how the USGS, when you're that entity tries to stay on the fence, and in some ways, are you limited in your communication? Would it be more? I mean, what would you suggest? I mean, if you have, is that a problem?
Well,
Sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
Oh no, I'm not working for them now. I'm speaking as an individual. I'm a free man at this point, but they're just trying to be apolitical, USGS, but it does tend to make it so conservative that it's also so gray, because they're not wanting to put some shoulds out there when there are some things. We do know enough about some things to be able to make pretty clear prescriptions, and as scientists, for land managers as well. But no, I respect a lot the position that Crystal's been taking on this, that we're missing by not communicating this fully and openly, what those benefits are, what those opportunities are. We're helping maintain the inertia of this somewhat, or to a large degree, dysfunctional historical status quo that's led us to this point, right? And then part of the way out of this is, having, as Bill was saying, there's hard conversations. We need to talk. Trade-offs are a real thing. So we need to talk about them, what they are. And that's, it's not all good. It's not all bad. There are trade-offs. And it does depend on where you're sit. It does depend on whose ox is getting gored. I mean, there's different interests in these things, but actually, John, I vote for a long time. My role, I always said, was as scientists working with land managers, we were trying to foster, adaptive, actually trying to do it, working hand in hand with the land managers here, and in particular, the Hammond Mountains landscape I've been in this whole time. But the role of science isn't to make the decisions. Okay, that's for sure. But we're, I think our job is to foster high quality conversations based upon our best current understanding, recognizing there's uncertainties and that understanding will change through time. But that's our job, is to foster the highest quality conversations we can with the public and, with everybody, whoever the different players are in these things. And so.
Yeah, okay, so maybe we'll throw it out to another question, Susie.
Sure, there are a lot of really great ones. Let's go with this one. What does the panel think of the role of mechanized removal of forest biomass as forest management ramps up in California? Do you see it as an opportunity to prevent additional CO2 emissions that come from prescribed burns if it can go to a bioenergy market instead?
You gonna send that to somebody first? Give them a first crack. I'm gonna take a first
one. Let's go with Joe.
Yeah, so yes, we need all the tools in the toolbox, plain and simple. I think that, You know, a lot of research has shown that prescribed fire has some unique benefits that may not be able to be replicated with thinning or other mechanical treatments. But absolutely, we you know, need to be seeing any proactive treatment as you know, a benefit compared to, you know, projected or expected losses down the road. And yes, as Craig said, it's a trade-off. You can calculate those trade-offs over time, but I really think that we need to increase the volume capacity of our processing, our biomass processing. We need to really, you know, streamline all of those efforts, including prescribed fire and other tools that maybe we haven't even thought of. But we need everything.
Other ideas? Panelists?
You know, I think one of the most frequent questions that that I get in talking to the media and talking to the public through, you know, through all sorts of avenues like these is, well, okay, you know, can we sin our way out of this threat? And what I always sort of respond to that is, we can use, as Joe notes, we need every tool in the toolbox, right? And we can use mechanical biomass removal very effectively in a targeted way. But the problem with the way we're trying to do it right now is that we see it as what should be a capitalistic enterprise that can be profitable, and therefore logging companies should be showing up to take out these trees so that they can make lots of money, instead of seeing it as a service to foster forest resilience and health, right? And it is one of those things that, you know, there's been so much conversation about forest thinning and biomass removal. You know, a lot of the biomass energy removal discussion is about, okay, well, how can we make money off of this? And my constant refrain is, has anybody ever sat down and calculated, you know, how much money we would save on fire suppression if we invest in this, right, rather than assuming that we should be trying to make money off of it? Because that's where we end up tying ourselves in knots and getting into, you know, a lot of these sort of political discussions, which never end well, you know, and some of the sort of ecosystem ramification, you know, positive or benefit and negative trade-offs discussions. Whereas if we focus on it as, all right, this is a service that needs to be done and we need to invest in this, whether it's at the state level, whether it's at the federal level, right? Rather than assuming that we should be, you know, asking private companies to come in and they should be able to make a profit off of it, and that's why they should want to do it, right? I think that will help us get more towards our ability to fully utilize that mechanical biomass removal tool.
I have another question from the chat box that I'd like to ask, and it's a science question. And this person wants to know, has there been any work after the 2020 season? Did any of the researchers have enough plots burned to be able to go out and look and see the effects of the tree mortality event on fire severity since the 2020 season?
Maybe we should send that to Christy first. Or,
yeah.
Are you there, Christy? Do you want to field that one? She's not there.
The answer is not yet, because most of those fire perimeters are snowy and people are gearing up right now. There is an effort actually funded through Save the Redwoods League to the Stevens Lab to try and coordinate post-fire sampling, not just for groves, but for burned areas in general. And there's a bunch of us, Jody Axelson, John Battles, myself, the forest, that are going to be within the fire perimeter doing sampling for a variety of reasons. And we're hoping to get that data in a consistent way and learn as much from it as possible. I think the limitation is not going to be post-fire sampling, it's going to be pre-fire data. So to learn the most, we need to know what the pre-fire structure was in terms of fuels. We'll have decent dead tree estimates from the aerial detection surveys, but that's only one piece of the puzzle, as we heard from Emilio and Leaf and lots of other folks, is that the coarse woody debris, what litter was on the ground, we don't have great surrogates for that. So yes, there are probably 20 different research groups. That's an exaggeration. I know there's at least 8 that will be out working in the fire, and we're trying to coordinate and collect data in a unified way. But what we'll be able to learn, I think, will be limited by the pre-fire information.
Great, thanks. And as just a follow-up question, I know that Bill spoke articulately about the need for understanding the thresholds. And Craig had great information on thresholds in his region. Are people working on thresholds for trees in the Sierra Nevada? And how is that process going? Is anybody working on that? I'm not sure who that question is for. Emilio or Jody possibly, who are connecting scientists together. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was about to jump in. The idea of this network is to improve what we know about the potential thresholds into mortality. We have planned this new remeasurements to get a new view about what has happened in the last few years about true mortality and the potential increase in fuels, but there is a lot of interdisciplinary work that is needed for this. I know that the U.S. Forest Service is also working with their own network of plots. So the idea is to, if possible, to organize in a way that all this information is compiled to get this more accurate estimation of what those thresholds can be for the future. I don't know if that answered that question, but.
Just to add in, especially, working on this project since 2017 with Susie and John and Emilio, sitting on the science advisory panel, I think that's our critical, I think that's the mission. I think that's the thing we have to try to, across scales and across the disciplines, there's all this great literature emerging about drying and vapor pressure deficit, and drought, the role of bark beetles, and we have all of the dynamics. We've got to, and I don't know how you do it exactly, but that seems like our major challenge is really integrating the amount of information we need to put the mechanisms that we so far understand to sort of come up with some thresholds and some predictive surfaces. Everywhere in the West, we have such large landscapes. We will never treat them all. We will never prescribe burn them all. And so we better be able to direct activities to where we think mortality impacts may be the greatest, which then have these cascading effects. And that's sort of my thoughts recently is, how do we do that is not standard. It's not easy.
I would agree with what Jody just said in that it gets more complex as you add in these additional things, and we need to be able to understand the limits to these different processes. But as much as we can too, we have to. It was exciting to hear in some of the other talks that there's work to identify individual trees and stands that are affected, because this mortality is often so patchy. You go into a forest that's affected and the mortality is elevated, but right next to a tree that died, there's one that's alive. And so the more information we can get about what the differences were between those trees, what can those trees tell us? How can we listen to them? Which one got attacked? Which one didn't? What was the species composition of what was impacted? What are the environmental variables outside of climate, like slope and aspect and soil and rooting depth? And the more that we can bound these conditions and start to discriminate between trees that made it and trees that didn't, in the past, that might be one of our most effective ways forward, because from a process-based standpoint, I do tree physiology. It was the heart of my PhD. It's that's only one facet of a many-faceted, really complex thing. I don't ever even think about like bark beetle outbreak dynamics. That's got to be like a couple PhDs worth of thought, anyways. And so I think just to bound these conditions, the more that we can record these observations of who made it and who didn't, and what were the differences, that might be a quicker way forward than getting all the way down into the mechanistic weeds. And at least at helping us make some better predictions, even if they're not always right.
Great, thanks, Bill. I think we're going to go into a poll and then maybe have the panelists respond to the poll question, and that's a way to close up and get people kind of get involved. So you ready there, Emilio, to put a poll up?
So I'm posting this right on the chat. So with the idea of feeding this panel discussion, essentially in the conclusion of day one of the workshop, please take a minute to answer the question that you see there. What are the three main takeaways that you think could be drawn from today's presentation. So I think that will help us wrap up the discussion and the day one and get ready for tomorrow. Let me quickly share the this. Yeah, great thoughts about collaboration and communications. This is gonna be a very useful to write sort of a final report after the workshop from which we can take important conclusions about how do we deal with this complex issue of tree mortality, fuels and fires and management in practice. I will maybe give 1 more minute. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, sounds fine.
Yes, there are still many unknowns about drought and fire interaction. Hopefully we can know more soon. Funding is also coming here in the answers about how to address all the treatments and restoration that is needed. There is another part here about the catastrophe term and how do we deal with that. And I think that's part of the communication part also, so which is important. Yeah, these are all very useful answers for getting some conclusions of this panel. This poll is closing soon, so I'll leave you, John, to
Got it.
let me let me stop sharing this. Great.
So I was going to invite the panelists to sort of share their thoughts on it, or sort of closing words of wisdom. So I think you definitely convinced us that big trees are in trouble. That came up a fair number of times.
I want to just add on that previous question about thresholds.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily my final comment overall, but if it ends up being so, oh well. I really think that we also need to, I know that this is a mortality workshop, but I think given the precipitation and climate change impacts that we're already seeing, we also need to be concerned about green trees. Fires are going to be moving through, green stands much more easily. I think that, yes, there's a lot of information and science that needs to go into the mortality and how to, respond to that, but that's only going to be one piece of the biggest puzzle, and so that's just one thought to leave everybody on.
Is that sort of reinforcement of your proactive scheme?
Yeah, just trying to make sure that my friend Lee Tarnay, always says green trees just don't know that there's smoke yet, and so I think that recognizing that this is not just a targeted approach, this is a universal approach, and we need to be taking these tools and research and pointing them not just backwards towards areas that have already died, but forwards into green stands as well.
Yeah.
That does raise one of the sort of research uncertainties, frontiers. There's been a fair amount of it in the last half dozen years, is right post-fire regen, in particular in high severity areas, but the intersection of that with the regeneration niche, the climate space that actually works, right? I mean, old trees, establishment is a choke point for a lot of organisms, plants. Often it's done pulsed. You look at something like ponderosa pine in the Southwest, there's only 2 or 3 good regeneration pulses a century when you look at the demography going back for centuries, in tree ring records. And it's usually these multi-decadal wet periods when there were, stand establishment events. are we having less of those? What happens? You know, you're talking about giant sequoias around the neon tower. You know what? There was a pulse, a human-induced pulse. But you know, there's a lot of landscape out there. We're not going to be, I mean, I know tomorrow there'll be a lot of discussion about reforestation and whatnot, but we're not reforesting most of the West or California. If, you know, if natural regeneration fails for some combination of increased disturbance processes and regen, I think that's an area that's going to need a lot more work in terms of, you know, what those thresholds are in terms of the regeneration niches of these things. Because as you said, Joe, I mean, you're opening it up, the microenvironment changes even apart from the disturbance processes. It's really different if you got a canopy and if you don't, or how dense the canopy, et cetera. So,
And just let me interject for a second. Thanks, Craig. There is a poll we'd ask you to fill out, just evaluating how the meeting went today. And so we can, you know, instant feedback, we can restructure tomorrow. So that'd be helpful while we're finishing up. So other.
I was going to note that I was thrilled to see Bill as part of this group and giving part of the plenary talk, in part because, you know, I'm a geographer. I tend to function at landscape scales, and looking through the list of participants in this, I see a lot of names I know that are also folks that tend to function at the landscape scale. And the thing I have really been fortunate to work on over the last several years with colleagues at the University of Idaho is better understanding of the tree physiology itself. You know, it's amazing that in 2021, we still don't know how fire kills trees, right? And the folks that Bill has been working with have been, you know, really putting out a lot of work on how drought kills trees the last few years. But man, how is it possible that we're talking about, well, how can we protect these trees? How can we, you know, reforest on these landscapes? And we still don't understand the mechanisms by which fire kills them, and how genetic diversity across these, you know, these systems means that the tree, one tree is still green and the tree right next to it is dead after a fire, right? So this is what I love to see is more tree physiology folks, you know, and even geneticists getting involved in some of these conversations and having more partnership across these scales, right? From the microbial up to the landscape, so that we can figure some of these questions out and then apply those findings to a lot of these management questions that we all have, right? And so I've recently learned that Bill's on his way to Oregon State. That's exciting to work with Crystal's group there. And it's just great to see more folks starting to ask these types of questions so that we can have a good research foundation to support a lot of these management questions of the landscape.
Crystal, thank you. It's good to be appreciated somewhere. A lot of times plant physiologists show up and everybody's like, oh, you're just going to complicate my mom, right? And so we're not a beloved people in broader circles. So it's good to be appreciated here. I will just say, kind of to my closing comment, relating back to green trees, and we need to think about them. I spent my whole PhD trying to figure out when a tree's living or dying, and one of the major findings was that especially evergreen trees, they can be dying and green for a long time, for months sometimes, maybe even a year, right? I'm looking at the Christmas tree I tossed over the fence into the woodland, and it's still green, right? And it's been cut for months. And the thing is just because a tree survives, and the vast majority of trees in most of these events, except for maybe Craig's backyard, the majority of trees often survive the extreme drought or heat, right? Or fire. Yet they might be altered in ways that leave a legacy on their function. And so these legacies of dysfunction, we almost know nothing about from the standpoint of physiology. And just because a tree looks green and survived that event, it might have lost half of its ability to move water, right? And so in the lagging years, we might see canopy dieback, and we might see these long tails of effects on a forest. And it's because we really, for all the work that's gone into understanding the moment of mortality, understanding that long tail and that legacy of having survived a near-death experience is a frontier that we've got to spend more time on. Yeah.
So Joe, you get the last word.
Oh man, I defer to Craig.
You can plug. No, you got to plug green trees again.
No, seriously, I just want to thank everybody for, inviting me to join this panel. I hope I was able to provide some context. Obviously, there's no real solutions, but I do, I guess if I were to give a final piece, it's not just about the trees, it's also about air. And this summer, we had a fire season, but we also had, over half of the population of California breathing unhealthy air for 30 days on average. And so I really feel like, this might resonate with people and constituents, based on what they're breathing rather than on what they're seeing on the landscape. So I think there's a lot of connectivity here as we try to approach this from multiple scales.
Great. Thanks. Well, I want to just thank all the panelists and the presenters today. If people could sort of unmute and just give them a hand. I think it was just and I appreciate everybody helping out and sharing their insights with us today. So same time, same place tomorrow, we'll be talking about reforestation after these disturbances. So great, thanks everybody, and again, much appreciated.
Thank
And
you
please
so
don't
much.
forget that there's a evaluation poll there, your last Menti. So please use that link and let us know how it went for you.